Catherine, never looking out of place or as anything other than the future Queen of the United Kingdom. She and William have grown and continue to grow into their role as modern senior royals.
What began as a tense evening with the Emir of Qatar took an unexpected turn when Princess Catherine stepped in with a gesture that changed everything. The Great Hall at Buckingham Palace was filled with light and sound. Long tables stretched from end to end, set with gold plates, tall glasses, and silver cutlery that caught the glow from chandeliers above. Everything looked grand, just as it always does when the royal family welcomes world leaders. But under all that glamour, something else was happening. The special guest that night was Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, the Emir of Qatar. At 45 years old, he had already spent more than a decade leading his country. People who knew him well often said he was calm but firm, a leader who demanded respect and wanted Qatar's voice heard. Only a few days before, he had spoken strongly at the United Nations in New York, accusing Israel of violence in Gaza. His words had been shared across the world. That same mood seemed to follow him to London. For King Charles, this banquet was more than food and speeches. Britain and Qatar were close partners in trade and energy. Qatar's wealth fund owned large parts of London, from famous shops to office towers. Keeping the Emir in good spirits was not just about manners, it was about trust between nations. Princess Catherine arrived in the hall with her usual grace. She wore a long ivory dress with a diamond tiara that had once belonged to the late Queen. Since returning to her royal duties earlier that year, after finishing her cancer treatment, her presence at events carried even greater meaning. Many saw her as a sign of hope, someone who could hold steady through hard times. At first, the evening went as planned. Guests chatted politely, glasses clinked, and soft music played in the background. But when everyone sat down to eat, the Emir's face told another story. His seat had been placed a few chairs away from the king, next to ministers and senior officials instead. To most people it would seem small, but in state visits, such details matter a lot. The Emir leaned back in his chair, his expression tight. His aides bent their heads together, whispering with looks of concern. People nearby began to notice. When leaders feel disrespected, even in small ways, it can turn into something larger. The room stayed lively, but under the surface, tension was building. Catherine watched from across the table. She had always been praised for knowing when someone felt uneasy. During school visits, she spotted shy children before anyone else did. On hospital tours, she noticed worried parents who tried to hide their stress. Tonight, her eyes told her that the Emir was not happy, and if nothing was done, the banquet could take a bad turn. She waited. It was not her way to rush or make a scene. When the first toast was raised, glasses lifted all around the table. At that moment, Catherine turned slightly toward the Emir. She looked him in the eye and smiled warmly. Not the stiff smile often used in formal pictures, but one that felt genuine, kind, and respectful. Then, with a gentle tilt of her head, she raised her glass directly toward him. It was a small action, but it meant a lot. The Emir stopped, holding her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded and lifted his glass in return. The lines in his face eased, and those sitting close to him noticed right away. His aides straightened in their chairs, less worried than before. As the meal went on, Catherine made sure to speak with him whenever the moment allowed. She did not bring up politics or business, but instead asked about his family. She spoke lightly but with interest, showing she had taken the time to know what mattered to him. The Emir began to relax. He spoke about his children with pride, something he rarely did in public. He smiled more, even laughed softly. The people around them felt the change. What had been a tense, uncertain table was now filled with easier conversation. British officials watched with relief. They knew how quickly these evenings could turn sour if a guest of honor felt ignored. Yet here was Catherine, without a script or official role, calming the situation with simple gestures and human warmth. By the time dessert was served, the emir was leaning forward, speaking with interest to a senior minister beside him. The earlier frown was gone. Praise for the banquet flowed more openly from his table, and his aides now looked content. Everyone could see that the princess had turned the mood with one thoughtful gesture, yet what she chose to do next would go even further, in a way that left the entire room watching closely. The first part of the banquet had been saved, but Catherine knew the night was not over. State visits were filled with careful steps. Every word, every look, and every gesture could carry meaning far beyond the walls of the palace. The emir was smiling now, but his earlier frown had left a mark. Catherine understood that if the mood was to hold, she needed to do more than ease the moment. She needed to show him that his place at the table and his voice in the world were fully respected. The speeches began. King Charles spoke warmly about the friendship between Britain and Qatar, praising the deep ties that connected the two nations. He highlighted energy cooperation, investments in British schools and hospitals, and the strong link between the two royal families. Applause followed, and the king raised his glass once again. When it was the emir's turn to speak, the room grew still. His English was clear, with a strong Qatari accent that gave weight to his words. He thanked the king for the welcome, but he did not stop there. He spoke of fairness in global politics, the need for peace in Gaza, and the duty of leaders to protect families caught in conflict. His voice was steady but firm, reminding everyone of his reputation as a leader who never stepped back from hard truths. Some guests shifted in their chairs. Political speeches at a state banquet could feel heavy, and not everyone expected such sharp words in a hall filled with gold and silver. Catherine, however, did not look away. She kept her eyes on him, nodding gently as he spoke, showing she was listening. It was a simple act, but for a man who valued being heard, it was powerful. When his speech ended, the room clapped politely, yet Catherine could sense the difference. Some clapped out of duty, while others hesitated. She decided to bridge the gap. Leaning toward the emir once the applause faded, she said with a soft smile, "Your words remind us all that families, no matter where they live, deserve safety and peace." It was not a long comment, but it was thoughtful. The emir looked at her with surprise, then appreciation. Her response had not ignored his message or tried to water it down. Instead, she linked it to something everyone in the room could understand: family. The emir's own pride as a father was well known, and Catherine had touched that chord once again. Soon after, the meal continued with light dishes, but the tension that had hung around the emir's speech seemed less heavy. Later in the evening, when the formal music paused, Catherine joined a smaller group around the emir. Instead of letting the talk return to trade deals or politics, she asked him about Qatar's schools. She had read about his country's big investments in education and sports, and she praised those efforts openly. "It gives so much hope to young people," she said, "when they see leaders putting schools and health first." The emir leaned in, speaking with more energy now. Education was one of his proudest areas of work, and he spoke of new projects, scholarships, and young athletes being trained for international competitions. Catherine listened with care, adding questions that showed she had done her homework. Her interest was not shallow. She had prepared for this. Those standing nearby could see how naturally the two connected. It was not about charm alone, but about real knowledge and respect. Catherine was showing him that she valued what mattered most to him, beyond titles and politics. As the night went on, the emir's earlier demands for recognition seemed to turn into praise. He began speaking highly of the British royal family to his aides, noting Catherine's grace and her thoughtful approach. The same man who had looked ready to leave the hall in frustration now looked fully engaged, even pleased. British ministers who had feared a diplomatic headache now looked relieved. They whispered among themselves that the princess had done what even the best-trained diplomats sometimes struggled to achieve. She had won respect, not with force or long arguments, but with human connection. The banquet drew on with more music, more toasts, and more polite talk. But the real story of the night was already clear. Catherine had stepped into a tense situation and managed to turn it around. Her simple words and small gestures had reshaped the evening. Still, the most surprising moment of the night had not yet happened. What she chose to do next would take the Emir's praise to an even higher level, leaving the entire hall in awe. The banquet hall at Buckingham Palace had settled into a more balanced mood, but the evening was still delicate. The Emir, though calmer, carried the weight of his country's pride with every word. Princess Catherine knew that one moment of misunderstanding could undo all the effort she had made so far. Every look, every smile, every pause mattered. Dinner was served in perfect order, with silver trays gliding through the room. Fine china, polished cutlery, and glasses filled with sparkling water or wine reflected the bright light above. Catherine leaned in lightly toward the Emir, showing him that he still had her full attention. She spoke about his visit to Oxford earlier that week, where he had met students from Qatar who were studying science and medicine. The Emir's expression softened. He was proud of those students, many of whom had scholarships funded by his government. Catherine told him she had read about a Qatari student working on renewable energy projects and how it connected with Britain's push for clean technology. "It is inspiring," she said with a warm tone, "to see young people lead the way." The Emir laughed, a short but genuine laugh. Around them, others noticed the change. The tension in his shoulders was easing. Catherine's strategy was simple but effective. Highlight what mattered to him, show respect, and draw connections that placed him and his people in a good light. King Charles, seated nearby, also observed. He did not interfere, but his eyes said everything. He trusted his daughter-in-law's calm approach. The Emir, known for his strong will, now seemed willing to listen. The conversation soon moved to football, a topic that always carried weight with the Qatari leader. With Qatar having hosted the FIFA World Cup in 2022, the Emir was deeply proud of how his country had managed such a global event. Catherine carefully joined in. She spoke of her children, especially Prince George, and how he had begun to follow football more closely. He was very excited watching England during the Euros, she added, her voice light but respectful. The Emir leaned closer, amused. "And does he support England only?" he asked, a spark of humor in his tone. Catherine smiled. "He tries to, but sometimes children choose their heroes from everywhere. He has his favorites." It was a simple exchange, but one that carried weight. It showed that Catherine was willing to share something personal, something human, that crossed the formal walls of a state banquet. For the Emir, who valued family deeply, this struck a chord. At the far end of the table, other guests were engaged in their own discussions, but it was clear the real center of attention was this unexpected dialogue between the Princess of Wales and the Emir of Qatar. Later in the evening, the Emir brought up trade again, his earlier frustrations returning in a lighter form. He spoke about how Qatar wanted more equal treatment in energy contracts. Catherine listened carefully, nodding when appropriate. She did not argue or try to solve the matter outright. Instead, she repeated what she had done earlier. She turned to shared values. "Your Majesty," she said, steady and clear, "the United Kingdom does not take lightly the strength of its partnerships. It is not only about numbers. It is about the future we want to build together." The Emir paused, looking at her with new eyes. This was not just polite talk. She was showing him that his concerns had been heard and respected. Without crossing into political promises she had no authority to make. It was a fine balance, and she carried it well. By dessert, the mood had fully shifted. Sweet dishes of fruit and tarts were placed on the table, and the Emir was no longer the restless guest he had been at the start. Guests nearby began to relax, engaging more freely in conversation. Music filled the room gently, a string quartet playing in the background. Catherine leaned back slightly, her posture still elegant, and glanced across the hall. She saw how the evening had transformed. What could have become an embarrassing scene for the palace was now turning into a story of diplomacy carried on a personal level. The Emir's aides, seated not far away, exchanged glances too. They seemed almost surprised at how quickly the tone of their leader had changed. They knew his reputation for being firm, for standing ground no matter the occasion. Yet here he was, openly laughing and nodding in conversation with Catherine. It was not that his demands had disappeared. They still mattered. But now, instead of being framed as frustration, they had become points of discussion wrapped in respect. The princess had managed to shift not just the emir's mood, but the atmosphere of the entire hall. Catherine had steadied the moment, but state banquets were long, and pride could resurface at any time. Still, she carried on with the same steady rhythm. But as the evening drew deeper, the emir surprised everyone with a comment that would change the tone even further. The emir sat back in his chair, his eyes fixed on Catherine as the chatter in the banquet hall carried on. For much of the evening, she had guided their exchange with patience and grace. And now, the moment came when he revealed what had weighed on his mind from the very beginning. He cleared his throat, lowering his voice just enough to draw attention from those close by. "Britain has always spoken of partnership," he said, measured and direct. "But sometimes I feel Qatar is asked to give more than it receives. This is not fair." The table grew still. His words were strong and, though polite, they touched on the very subject that had caused tension earlier in the night. A few aides shifted in their seats, uneasy with the bluntness. King Charles remained calm but watchful, giving Catherine the space to respond. Catherine leaned in slightly, her tone even. "Your Majesty, I hear what you are saying. It is important that respect works both ways. I believe this evening shows that your voice is valued here." The emir studied her face. He was not used to hearing such a simple but firm answer from a royal figure. Most would turn the matter aside with vague talk. Catherine, however, had acknowledged his concern without making excuses. That caught his attention. Sensing the silence across the table, Catherine took it further. She reminded him of Britain's deep ties with Qatar, not in contracts or money, but in human exchange. She spoke about the many Qatari families who had made London their second home, the students who studied in British schools, and the doctors who trained in British hospitals. "That is more than business," she said gently. "That is trust." The emir's expression softened again. He leaned forward, replying in a tone far less sharp. "You speak with honesty, Princess. That is rare." For a moment, the tension that had risen again dissolved. Around the table, other guests relaxed, quietly relieved. Catherine had not avoided the subject. She had faced it head-on, but with respect. The conversation moved on with ease. Catherine shifted to lighter ground, asking about the emir's plans to expand Qatar's cultural reach through museums and art. He brightened, sharing his vision of making Doha a hub for global culture. Catherine listened with interest, mentioning her own visits to art galleries with her children, linking her family life to his ambition in a natural way. The emir chuckled, clearly pleased. "You remind me that leaders are also parents. Perhaps that is what the world forgets sometimes." Those seated nearby exchanged smiles. The once tense mood had become almost warm, with laughter breaking through now and then. What had begun as a demanding presence from the emir was slowly turning into open praise. As the evening drew on, speeches were delivered. King Charles gave a thoughtful address about friendship between nations, speaking with his usual careful tone. When the emir was invited to give his own words, the room held its breath. Everyone remembered his sharpness at the start of the night, but his tone was different now. Standing tall, he spoke not of unfair treatment or demands, but of shared respect. He praised the hospitality of the palace, the history of Britain, and the warmth shown to him that evening. He even turned to Catherine directly, thanking her for her kindness during their exchange. His words drew applause. King Charles nodded with quiet approval, but it was Catherine who received the most subtle acknowledgement. Guests whispered among themselves about how the Princess of Wales had changed the atmosphere with nothing more than steady conversation and a human touch. As the speeches ended, the emir returned to his seat, visibly lighter than when he had arrived. The sharp edges of his earlier remarks had softened into admiration. His aides, who had been tense for much of the evening, now looked more at ease. Catherine did not bask in the attention. She simply returned to her quiet posture, smiling politely and carrying on with the meal. But everyone in the room knew what had just happened. The princess had managed to turn pointed demands into gracious praise. The music swelled again as the evening approached its close. But for Catherine, the night was not quite finished. There was one more exchange still to come, one that would leave an impression far beyond the walls of Buckingham Palace. The banquet was drawing to a close. Plates had been cleared, the music softened, and guests were preparing to rise. The Emir of Qatar had already surprised the room by shifting from criticism to praise in his speech. But it was Catherine's presence beside him that still held the evening together. As the Emir stood to leave, he turned toward her with a look that was rare for him, a look of gratitude. His aides were ready to escort him out, but he held back for a moment. "Princess," he said quietly, "you reminded me tonight why respect is earned, not demanded. For that, I thank you." Catherine smiled gently, lowering her head in a small nod. It was not her way to claim credit, but the guests nearby heard his words, and it was clear to everyone that the Emir had been moved. Then came the moment that no one expected. As the Emir reached for his coat, Catherine lightly touched her chest with one hand and extended the other toward him. It was not a handshake in the stiff diplomatic sense, but a simple, warm gesture of goodwill. The Emir paused, then placed his hand over his heart in return, mirroring her. It lasted only seconds, yet the room went silent. Cameras clicked quietly from the far end of the hall. What could have been remembered as an evening of tension was now sealed with a gesture of mutual respect. King Charles, watching nearby, gave a small, approving smile. He knew how delicate these moments could be. Catherine had done more than calm a guest. She had strengthened a fragile bond without saying anything grand. As the Emir walked out, he spoke once more for all to hear. "Britain has shown friendship tonight. May this spirit guide our partnership forward." His words echoed warmly across the hall, and even those who had worried earlier found themselves nodding in agreement. When the doors closed behind him, the atmosphere in Buckingham Palace was lighter than it had been all evening. Guests began to talk freely, praising the princess's role. Some noted how she had listened instead of rushing to answer. Others admired how she had kept the focus on shared values rather than points of conflict. For Catherine, it was not about praise. She rejoined Prince William, who had been speaking with other guests, and quietly asked about their children. "George will want to know if it all went well," she said with a soft laugh. It was a reminder that behind the tiara and formal setting, she was still a mother who thought of her family first. In the days that followed, news outlets picked up on the story. Photographs of the Emir and Catherine's shared gesture spread quickly. Commentators highlighted how a tense moment had been turned into one of warmth, not by political speeches, but by human connection. Reports from Doha also reflected the change. Newspapers there praised the Princess of Wales for showing genuine respect to the Emir. For Qataris, it mattered deeply that their leader had been listened to in such a public setting. It showed that dignity had been protected, even far from home. Diplomats noted the significance too. A senior figure in the Foreign Office was quoted as saying, "Sometimes diplomacy happens in meeting rooms with documents, but sometimes it happens in small gestures at the dinner table." That night was one of the latter. Catherine, as always, said nothing publicly about the evening. She carried on with her work in early childhood initiatives, visiting schools and charities in the weeks ahead. Yet those who had been at Buckingham Palace would not forget the night when her calm presence shaped the outcome of a state banquet. It showed the unique role she played. She was not elected, she was not a politician, but she was able to represent her country with humanity and care. Where others might raise their voices or stand firm with words, she had shown the strength of listening and the power of one graceful gesture. And so the story of that night lived on, not as a tale of conflict, but as one of understanding. Guests who had entered the hall with unease left with admiration. The Emir, who had arrived with demands, left with respect. And Catherine, who never sought the spotlight, became the center of it all. The banquet ended as it had begun, under the golden lights of Buckingham Palace. But thanks to one princess and one gesture, its memory would shine far brighter than anyone had expected, reminding us that sometimes the smallest actions leave the strongest mark. What do you think about Catherine's way of handling the emir that night? Do you believe such small gestures really can change the tone of big events? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear them. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the following video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.